Today we are replacing the CV axle on our 93 Del Sol SI. Here you can see the current axle boot is torn, axle grease spewing out everywhere. We've got to replace this before any damage is done to those bearings. So let's get started. After jacking the car up, you're going to remove the wheel from whichever side we're trying to replace the axle on, because the first step is we need to loosen up this axle nut, and you can see that it's pinched in at this point, which will prevent it from turning. So we're going to use a punch, and we're going to punch this little indentation back out so that we can turn this nut properly. Because of the tight space for this little slot here, I'm just going to use this flathead screwdriver tip and get it just in the right place here and smash the end of it with a mini sledgehammer and just unbend this little dent. Now you can see that we've successfully unbent the edge of this axle nut so that we'll be able to get this off. Don't worry if you damage this edge at all. Your new CV axle kit will come with a new nut. We've got the car back on the ground so that the wheel won't turn. You don't have to put the lug nuts on super tightly, just gotta thread them a little bit. And then we're going to try to get this axle nut off. We're going to use a 32mm axle nut socket, and I've got a 24-inch breaker bar on this, so we'll see if we can just break that loose with just this. It was no go with the breaker bar, so we went to the impact wrench, and we've got that off there now. So this is free, and don't unthread it all the way, just leave it on a little bit, and then we're just going to go ahead and jack the car back up. Now that the car is jacked up and we have the wheel back off, we are going to remove all the pieces that are keeping this axle in place. The first thing we're going to do is use a 12mm ratchet to remove this bolt down here that's securing this brake line bracket, and then this one up front, which you probably can't fit a full socket in there, so hopefully you have something like this, like a ratcheting open wrench here that you can put over there, and we're going to take those off to get this brake line out of the way so we don't mess it up. Now that our brake line's safely up out of the way, we will just put a 14mm socket on here and loosen or remove this top bolt on the suspension fork. After removing the top bolt on the pinch fork, you will put a 17mm socket on the bolt head on that side, and then we're going to put a open wrench 17mm around the nut on the other side to keep it from spinning. We have got the nut off of the bottom of the suspension fork, so we're just going to give it a little tap to knock that bolt out the other side. Once the top and bottom bolts are off, you can just work this pinch fork right off of the strut, and then we're just going to pull it out and set it aside. The next step is to remove or separate the lower control arm from the steering knuckle. It's all held together by this castle nut with a cotter pin stuck through it. So you will need to unbend the cotter pin, pull it out, and then loosen the castle nut. But don't take it off just yet, just loosen it. We have removed the cotter pin, which by the way you cannot reuse. You need to make sure you have a new one on hand to put this all back together. And we have also loosened the castle nut, but we haven't removed it yet. We're going to put a puller on here to pop this loose without damaging the tie rod. Here's what the tie rod separator tool looks like. It's like a $35 tool, but you can borrow it from an auto parts store if you don't want to buy one. This top part here is going to slide in right in this spot, and then this bottom part is going to push against the bottom of this pin of the bolt. So with this in place here, as you screw this bolt on the separator, eventually you will just hear a loud pop, and that's when everything's been separated without damaging anything. And then you'll stop after that pop. You just need to break it loose, and then you'll remove this whole thing, and you can remove the castle nut, and these two pieces will come apart very easily at that point. Alright, pull these apart, and the tie rod's up out of the way. By the way, again, you can see all the disgusting grease back here, but now all we need to do is remove the axle first from the wheel hub, So you can just finish taking off the axle nut this way, and you're going to pull this whole assembly with the rotor and everything off of the end of that axle. And when you do that, you want to still try to maintain some support on the axle so that it won't just fall and put a lot of pressure on the inside joint of the CV axle. As you can see, there's some corrosion in here, which actually made this a little bit tight. So I just took my 17mm socket and I'm putting it in backwards on this just because it fits in there nicely, and I can just tap on the end of this with my Mini-sledge to tap out the axle out the other side. If you need some more play to work the end of this axle out of the hub, you can also remove this cowsel nut here and disconnect from up top, and then this will allow this whole wheel hub assembly to give you a lot more room to move around. I went ahead and disconnected the upper control arm here so that I get just a lot more play, and made it really easy to just pull this hub off enough to free up the axle, which is right now just kind of resting right here. I'm going to use some wire and tie this axle up so it can't put too much pressure when I work out the inside joint, which I'll show you in a little bit. I've looped a old coat hanger here just around a spring coil and around the CV axle just to give it some extra support in case it slips off of what it's just resting on right now. I just don't want it to just fall down and put too much pressure on the inside joint. We're going to go under the car next and show you how to pull the axle out. We're underneath the car here, and you can see where the CV axle here meets with the transmission. We're just going to use a pry bar, get in between the two, and pop it out. You should probably put a drip pan underneath. You might leak a little bit of fluid. So here you can see we just popped this out with a pry bar. It wasn't too difficult. And now we can just slide the whole axle out. Here I have my new CV axle ready to go in. Before I put it in, I'm actually going to take the new axle nut that came on the new axle, and I'm going to remove it and set it aside. I'm going to use that later, but I'm going to just take the old one and I'm going to thread it back on here, because at one point I'm going to bang on the end of this with a hammer to seat this axle fully, and I would rather bang on this old messed up axle nut than risk damaging my new one. When you insert the inner end of the CV axle into the transaxle, you will note that there are these teeth here, and they need to line up. So as you are inserting it, just kind of slowly rotate the whole thing to one side or the other until you feel it seat properly into these splines, and then do the rest of the insertion. When you're installing this new axle, also do the same thing as you did with the old axle, taking it out. Support the far end of it with a wire and make sure that it is not just free hanging, because you do not want this piece to ever be just inserted and just hanging with gravity. You're going to damage the inner seating on the other side of this. I have the new axle inserted. It's not fully seated yet. I'm going to have to whack on the end of this with a hammer to fully seat it. That's why I put this old nut on here, so I'm actually going to be hitting the end of the nut instead of ever putting impact on the axle itself, so I can't damage my new axle this way. I've got the new axle fully seated in place by hitting the end of this, and of course you can see the beat down that this old axle nut took, which is exactly why I didn't want to do that with the new one on there. So we're just going to unscrew that off and rework this axle back into the wheel hub. As soon as you get the wheel hub back onto the new axle, enough to just start threading this axle nut, the new axle nut, by hand. Go ahead and do that a couple turns just so that everything can't fall back off again. Then we're going to go ahead and reattach everything that we pulled apart earlier. When we're reassembling, I start with the pinch fork, so I have this bolt threaded but not torqued down, as well as the bolt that goes through the bottom to this nut, also threaded but not torqued down. So that's the first thing you'll put back in. Then you're going to guide the tie rod into place here and start to thread that cowsel nut back in. The last thing we're going to do is reattach the upper control arm. This little tip should save you a little bit of effort. You just take a secondary jack. I just have this little baby jack that I'm going to put right underneath to push this up to make it much easier to redo this connection right here without having to, try to push up super hard with one hand while pulling on the other. Now I can just do it all self-supported here. Now that we have all of the bolts threaded, it's time to start torquing them down. We're not going to torque the axle nut yet. This castle nut down here, we're going to tighten to 32, and then we're going to put in a new cotter pin to hold that into place. The castle nut on the upper control arm ball joint is also going to be torqued to 32 foot-pounds, and then we'll insert a cotter pin in there as well. The top of the pinch bolt is also going to 32. These are foot-pounds, by the way, 32 foot-pounds. And then the bottom of the fork is going to go to 47. Once all those bolts are tight, make sure you reattach your brake line brackets properly, and then just use a hand ratchet and just tighten this up. You're not going to get it to full torque with this off the ground. Just tighten it up until it's kind of spinning on its own. Then we're going to put the wheel back on without the center cap and lower this back to the ground so we can apply full torque without spinning the whole hub. Alright, the wheel is back on. The lug nuts are not super tight, but they're just on. Lowered this to the ground so that the wheel can't spin, and now we need to tighten the axle nut to 134 foot-pounds. If you have a torque wrench that goes that high, great. I don't. Mine only goes to 80, so I'll just get it nice and tight. I guess is the best way to feel at 134 foot-pounds. I'm probably going to use my impact wrench to just give it a final shove at the end. After you have this all tightened down, you're going to need to use a punch or a chisel to kind of crush the end of this axle nut back into this indentation so that there's no way that it can spin beyond just a little play you have right there. Depending on what type of wheels you have, you might need to pull the car back up and take the wheels off to get good access to that. That's just going to be dependent on your wheels. I took my wheels off just to protect them, and I took a big flathead screwdriver and just hammered on the end of it to make this little dent in here, so now this nut is totally locked into place. Alright, we're just going to tighten down the lug nuts to 80 foot-pounds, pop the center cap back on, and we are all done.